This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 978 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. You can consume the Late Round Prospect Guide right now. All you have to do is head to lateround.com to check it out. The guide includes 160 pages of information on my prospect and year 2 models. It's got 80 prospect profiles, there's about 40 year 2 profile write-ups, there's rankings, and more. And with the purchase, you not only get the pre-draft version, but you get the post-draft version as well. And that post-draft version, it's updated the final day of the NFL draft. It'll be in your inbox that night. I know you have rookie drafts, and I know that you're ready to dominate them. Learn more about it over on lateround.com. And if you're on the site, subscribe to the newsletter too. It's absolutely free. You get content straight to your email inbox. Plus, it's an easy way to support Late Round Fantasy Football. But that's all on lateround.com. Now let's get to these mailbag questions. The first question is from Twitter, is from @TNewman12. It says, as it stands now, do you like Jaylen Warren or Najee Harris more? Steelers may add running back depth, but I assume Warren now has the lead role. So I asked if this was for redraft or for dynasty, and the person responded and confirmed that it was for redraft purposes. Now I'm going to be doing a free agency podcast at the beginning of next week, so I'm not going to get to every free agency signing on today's show. But I do want to talk about this. Right now, I think it's probably Najee Harris over Jaylen Warren, but I actually do think it's kind of close. Now I haven't built out my projections yet, so I can't lean on that much. I'll be doing that over the next few weeks. But I do think it's Najee Harris over Jaylen Warren right now. But I do want to talk about this a little bit further. This time of year, especially with this running back draft class, you've got to think about range of outcomes even more than usual. When we usually think about range of outcomes, we're doing it knowing what our limitations are. We know who the player's teammates generally are and what that situation generally looks like. That's because most range of outcomes conversations are happening in like late July and in August when we're drafting our redraft teams. We're not there with Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris. Warren now has Kenneth Gainwell and Cordero Patterson to fight off, which means we very easily could see the Steelers getting someone in this year's draft. And you could very easily argue that LA's competition for Najee Harris is even worse. It's Hassan Haskins and Kamani Vidal. So strictly based on the team today, Harris is probably in a better spot than Jaylen Warren. He's the safer bet to see work. He'd be more of a bell cow. And there are more question marks around the Steelers at the time of this recording too. I have no idea right now who their starting quarterback's going to be next year. But I've been really surprised, and this is why I really wanted to talk about this. I've been really surprised seeing the reaction to Najee Harris signing with the Chargers across the fantasy space. Everyone seems to think that he's like a locked-in mid-range RB2 now. And while I do love the landing spot for him, I think context is needed. The Chargers signed him for about $5 million in guaranteed money. That's not that much, and it's a 1-year deal. You can sit there and say that Jim Harbaugh really loves a running back like Najee Harris, and he specifically loves Najee Harris. And I do agree that Harris is a really good fit in this Greg Roman offense. But the money that they gave him, the commitment that they gave Harris, it's not strong at all. And meanwhile, at the very least, they need some depth at running back. And beat reporters, they're already talking about adding more players, adding more pieces to that backfield. Daniel Popper of The Athletic, he said, quote, Harris is not a home run hitter, but the Chargers have other means of adding that juice to the running back room. AKA, there's a chance that they go into the draft and they get more explosiveness. Maybe they try to replicate what we see in Detroit with the Sonic and Knuckles thing, where Najee Harris is the Knuckles. Like, I know that people have to create content, and I know that it's very important to generate clicks and to generate views. I get it. I run a business too. But it's wild to me seeing all these videos and all these takes out there saying that Najee Harris is automatically now their bell cow. I actually said this on the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord the other day. You can join via the Patreon. But I'm never going to buy into an elite workload, a projected elite workload for a non-elite player when there's so much that can change from now until the start of the season. Now, could Najee Harris walk into the 2025 season and see a ton of work for the Chargers? Of course. I think he is going to see a lot of work. But I don't know if it's going to be a true bell cow workload. And when he's not the most efficient back in the world, when he's not the most explosive back in the world, that does matter. That matters for ceiling purposes. And when you look at that depth chart, it's not strong at all. We're talking about Hassan Haskins, who's been a journeyman, and Kamani Vidal, who was a day 3 back last year and didn't show us that much as a rookie. Why should we assume that this team is done at running back? And look, the same thing goes for Jaylen Warren. I think the difference between Harris and Warren, though, is that Warren does have that floor from a receiving perspective. Greg Roman offenses have not been friendly to running backs through the air. And you can sit there and say, oh, it's because he had Lamar Jackson or Colin Kaepernick or whoever. Last year with Justin Herbert, they were 31st in the league in running back target share. Really, what I'm trying to say here is that it's March. We need to be open-minded to a lot of different outcomes. There's an outcome where Najee Harris does get a good workload. There's an outcome where Jaylen Warren does too. But I think if you objectively look at these backfields, neither one of them look very complete. So right now, I'll probably just lean Najee Harris because I do think he's going to see some work in that backfield, and we have more of a backbone of him seeing a lot of work. But I don't think this case is closed at all. I think this can still go in a lot of different directions. And I'm definitely not ready to crown either one of these players with this awesome draft class coming up. This next question is from Patreon. It's from NKOTF_FF. The question says, is some combination of actual draft capital and projected draft capital more predictive than just draft capital by itself? And then in parentheses, it says, maybe this is basically what the value conversation was during the second half of the episode from today, but just thought I would ask. No, so this is not something I talked about on that episode earlier this week, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to that episode, hit pause right now, go back and listen. I've gotten a lot of response from that episode. I absolutely love it. It was one of those shows where it's a little bit different. I could get super nerdy, and it resonated with people, which is my favorite kind of episode. It starts a discussion. It starts people asking me a lot of questions. But I'd been meaning to test this since getting all of that data. I finally did test it. At wide receiver, it made no difference. Raw draft capital, the actual draft capital that a wide receiver saw, it was better for the model than some combination of projected draft capital and that actual draft capital. But that makes sense because when I tested the projected draft capital and did that episode earlier this week, there really wasn't that much signal at wide receiver aside from when there were big reaches, which was one of the main conclusions from that show. So the other end of the spectrum, there was a lot of noise. The only thing that mattered was the big reaches, which means across the overall sample, we weren't going to get that much correlation, which is why it wouldn't work in the model. But here's the thing, at running back, there was some signal at either end. When teams got values, it did show up in fantasy to some degree. And when there were reaches, it did the opposite. Well, when I mix in projected draft capital, mock draft big board data, when I mix that with actual draft capital at running back, the running back model actually did get better. So there's a very real chance this is going to be part of the running back model in the post-draft version of the guide. A very real chance. Now, it's not a huge amount. It's like a 90-10 split. But that 10% gets enough signal to be worthwhile. And for the players who were drafted before 2016, because the mock draft data, it goes back to 2016, those players are just getting their actual draft capital in the model. So like, for example, Devin Singletary, he had draft capital of 74 overall, but his projected capital was 107th overall. So he was kind of a reach. The draft capital number that's being used in the model right now with these changes would be 80. So instead of 74, it's dropped a little bit to 80. Now, I know that doesn't sound that significant, and it's not overly significant. But for certain players, there is a pretty big gap. So basically, with this mock draft data, with projected draft capital, we're at a point where it could directly impact the running back model. And then on the wide receiver side, we're worried about those reaches. It's kind of cool how it all worked out. And again, I really appreciate everyone's feedback on that episode. It was a really fun one to do. This next one's an email. I actually got a question on Twitter that was really similar, but it says, "Hey JJ, big fan of your work. Thanks. Looking through this year's prospect guide and listening to the show since discovering it last year have been some of the best fantasy content I've come across. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I've heard you and many other fantasy and NFL analysts talk about how this year's rookie running back class is looking like a generational one, or at least the strongest that we've seen in some time, while the wide receiver class is pretty weak. It's been hard for me to reconcile this with what I'm seeing in most rookie rankings, however. Your prospect guide identifies more elite producers and flex plays at wide receiver than running back, while identifying the same number of weekly starters. Looking at your single quarterback rankings, there are more wide receivers than running backs ranked in the first and second rounds. Other rankings I've seen are similar in that generally there seem to be more wide receivers ranked highly than running backs. What does it mean for this to be a strong rookie running back class when most rankings are still recommending wide receivers to be taken over running backs at most points in the draft? Should we be reaching for running backs over wide receivers even when rankings we trust have wide receivers higher? Thanks, Charlie. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. First, I think it's really important to not just do a one-to-one comparison across positions with the positional categories that I created for the prospect guide. For those of you who don't know, I'm now categorizing prospect scores into 6 categories: elite producers, weekly starters, flex plays, bench warmers, waiver wire ads, and dart throws. I didn't create those with the intent to compare across positions. Just like a 99 score in the wide receiver model might not be the exact same thing as a 99 score in the running back model. Those categories, they're just there to give you context about what the prospect score is actually saying about that player within his position. Second, I think it's really important for everyone to know, at least from my perspective, that I look at rookie rankings differently pre versus post draft. I'd imagine that everyone does. Pre-draft, we have incomplete information. We don't know the actual draft capital that these players are going to see. Post-draft, we have that information. What that means is that post-draft, we can have more conviction. So pre-draft right now, we're likely going to play things a little bit more conservatively. And the running back class, even if it's really good, can still go in a lot of different directions. We don't know exactly how NFL teams are going to view these guys, which is why my rookie rankings are set up the way they're set up right now. Like, you mentioned that there are more wide receivers in my rookie rankings in the top 2 rounds than running backs. But 5 of the top 8 players are running backs. They represent the first 4 tiers of my rankings. The most important picks in rookie drafts right now are running backs, because the top 5 running backs in this year's class, they're the ones who are clear locks to be day 1 or day 2 picks. No, I don't think just arbitrarily stopping at the end of round 2 is telling us anything about the quality of this class. Round 2 being round 2 in a rookie draft. Meanwhile, NFL teams are always going to spend higher draft capital on wide receiver because it's a more important position. And draft capital correlates to how well a player is going to perform in fantasy football. So pre-draft here in March, I'd sometimes rather play it safe with a day 1, a day 2 wide receiver than a running back who might be drafted on day 3. Now, that doesn't mean that the running back class is now overrated. The class is just really, really deep. So we don't know which direction these teams are going to go in for the individual running back. Like, let's just look at DJ Giddens. I like DJ Giddens a lot, or Bashal Tutin. But neither player right now is a lock to be a day 2 running back. And if they go on day 3, their outlooks do change when we're prospecting analytically. The team investment is not as strong. And keep in mind, too, that the 2017 running back class, the one that we're always comparing this class to, it didn't get crazy draft capital. I wrote a newsletter about this last week. That 2017 class, from a depth perspective, it's a lot like this 2025 one. There's just so much talent littered around this class. The 2 production metrics that the ZAP model looks at with running backs, best season reception share and breakout score, this year matches up really well to 2017. They're basically the 2 best classes in the ZAP model since 2011. That's when the model dates back to. And just like in 2017, we don't have some outlier number of running backs projected to go in the top 100. I mean, we might see something change in the actual draft, but right now, from a projected draft capital standpoint, we've only got 7 running backs projected to go in the top 100. That's the same that we saw in 2017. Meanwhile, we've had seasons since 2011 where 8 to 10 running backs went in the top 100. Basically, what I'm getting at here is that there's a healthy mix of high-end talent with a lot of depth in this class. And that's why people are comparing it to 2017, like myself. Because most classes don't have this much depth. Maybe that won't show up on day 1 or day 2 of the draft, but it's definitely there. The talent profiles are absolutely there. Meanwhile, because there's so much depth, that means that things can go in a lot of different directions on the individual level. There's a very high likelihood that some of these running backs get higher draft capital than we're expecting right now. We just don't know exactly which running backs we're talking about here. Once we do, we're going to feel more confident in them. And when we feel more confident in them, we're going to rank them higher. So I can almost guarantee you that more running backs will rise up rookie rankings after the draft is over. Because at that point, we're going to have more complete information. The last question is another email. It says, "Hi JJ, excited to enter another prospect season with your thoughtful analysis. Thanks. Your discussion about Quinshon Judkins' receiving profile in episode 976 had me wondering whether there are any relevant examples of past running back prospects who didn't have great receiving metrics, but did have a running back in their same backfield, like Travion Henderson, who had good receiving metrics. And specifically, whether that context can help us spot a running back prospect who may have lacked receiving work in college, but then saw solid receiving stats when they got to the pros. Thanks." So after having a few conversations about the fact that the ZAP model doesn't use any rushing production metrics for the running back model, I've had some pushback. And it's almost always about Quinshon Judkins. People seem to think that there's no way the ZAP model can like him. And I would say that before you jump to conclusions, see what the model is actually saying. Not that that's what's happening here with this question. I'm just saying generally. I wouldn't make assumptions about who the model does and doesn't like without actually seeing who the model does and doesn't like. But regarding your question specifically, I think one thing to keep in mind is that Judkins didn't play with Travion Henderson every year of his collegiate career. He only did for one season. Now, he had some decent competition at Ole Miss, but he only played with Henderson for one of 3 seasons. And he never reached a 9% prorated reception share in any season. And his receiving yards per team pass attempt never reached 0.4. For some context, the average best season receiving yards per team pass attempt in this year's class was 0.7. Now, I have a metric in the running back model called teammate score. It looks at current season and previous season backfield competition to see if any of them were worthy enough of generating a score. That score then increases a player's prospect score. It's not a perfect metric, but it does help the model get more signal. But to reiterate, Judkins had a best season reception share below 9%. So we'll look at all running backs who had a best season reception share below 10% alongside a teammate score that was non-zero in the ZAP model. This dates back to 2011. So we're looking at guys who didn't have good receiving profiles, but did have good teammate competition, which is exactly what this question is asking. That gives us 21 running backs. And of those 21 running backs, the only one to have better than a 10% target share in one of their first 3 seasons is Josh Jacobs. But keep in mind, Jacobs had an 82 breakout score. Judkins is at 45. Jacobs had a best season receiving yards per team pass attempt of 0.59. Judkins was below 0.4. And of course, Josh Jacobs was a first-round pick. Chances are that's not going to happen for Judkins. Now, I've said it before, but players who have had sub-50 breakout scores and sub-10% best season reception shares, they basically never give us elite receiving production in the NFL, regardless of the competition that they saw in college. In the ZAP model database, we've had 14 players below both of those marks who were drafted in the top 100. I'll just read you the names who fit the mold, who had a sub-50 breakout score and a sub-10% best season reception share. Now remember, Quinshon Judkins is going to be added to this list more than likely. But it's Alex Green, Stephen Ridley, Bernard Pierce, Doug Martin, Lamar Miller, Niall Davis, Carlos Hyde, Jerick McKinnon, Terrence West, Matt Jones, Derrick Henry, Deontay Foreman, Darrington Evans, and Ty Davis Price. Of that group, Doug Martin and Jerick McKinnon, they were the only 2 to get to a 10% target share in one of their first 3 seasons. And they weren't a whole lot past 10%. Now, I know that list is really, really bad. That does not mean that Quinshon Judkins is toast. Now, admittedly, the model's probably going to like him less than what draft capital says. but not to some extreme amount where he becomes a high-risk player, because there are other factors in the model, size being one of them, speed score being one of them, teammate score being one of them. And given the way that Caleb Johnson is trending in mock drafts right now, the aggregate data, Judkins seems pretty likely to be the model's RB4. What this receiving stuff just means is that I think that we're looking more at like a Jonathan Taylor usage outcome on the higher end, as opposed to like Bijan Robinson, where we know that good receiving numbers are going to be there. There are many ways to score fantasy points. Judkins is probably just going to do a little bit more on the ground than other backs in this class, while maybe doing a little bit less through the air. That doesn't mean that he's some terrible prospect. It doesn't mean that the Zap model doesn't like him. It's just something that we should be aware of that's happened historically. There's always a chance that he finds a team that also doesn't care. Maybe they just want to use him as a receiving threat. Maybe he's used as a receiver more than expected. At the end of the day, everyone, this is just about probability. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next week.